Chapter the 9th. After midnight, we're gonna let it all hang out. Harry had never believed he would meet a boy he hated more than Bubba, but that was before he met Ronald Weasley. He was always hanging around, lurking. Harry couldn't get rid of the chap. And since they were in the same house, they had all their classes together. Draco Malfoy, on the other hand, was quickly becoming one of Harry's good friends. Might even be BFF material, Harry thought. Still, first-year Gryffindors only had potions with the Slytherins, so he didn't have much of a chance to really get to know Malfoy all that much. Or at least, he didn't until he noticed a notice pinned up in the Gryffindor common room. Flying lessons would be starting on Thursday, and Gryffindor and Slytherin would be learning together. "Oh, goody," said Harry with some excitement. Maybe he and Malfoy could fly off on a broomstick together? He had been looking forward to learning to fly more than anything else. As a toddler, he would imagine himself growing wings and flying off to exotic lands away from the Drubbles Norts. And now, he's just days away from doing it for else. "Oh, now isn't that just perfect, more time with the Slytherins and that Malfoy," said Ron mockingly. Harry felt a little jealousy in his voice. "Anyway, I know Malfoy's always going on about how good he is at Quidditch, but I bet he can't walk the talk." Malfoy really did talk about flying a lot. He even filed a formal complaint about how first years are barred from getting on house Quidditch teams and told long, boastful stories that always seemed to end with him narrowly escaping mole-flying contraptions. He wasn't the only one, though. Seamus Finnegan was a blabbermouth too. Seemed his pop made him spend most of his childhood zooming around the countryside on his broomstick to practice. Says he hated the long hours at first but then learned to like it as he developed what his father called discipline. Even Ron would tell anyone who'd listen, which wasn't many, about the time he hit what turned out to be a cell tower on Charlie's old broom. He was hospitalized for 2 months. Everyone from wizarding families had a very strange obsession about Quidditch. Ron had already had an intense fight with Dean Thomas, who shared their dormitory, over soccer. Ron couldn't see what was so exciting about a game with only one ball and where no one was allowed to use their hands. He called it boring, childish, and that he'd rather go to 1,000 Snape lectures than sit through one match of soccer. By the end both boys had to go to the hospital wing to get fixed up. Neville had never been on a broomstick in his life, because his grandmother had never let him near one. Privately, Harry felt she probably had good reason because Neville always managed to have an extraordinary number of accidents everywhere he went. Neville was the personification of Harry's clumsiness on steroids. He ended up needing 4 separate trips to the hospital wing in the first week of term alone and had several near misses. Hermione Granger was more nervous about flying than Neville was. This was something you couldn't learn by heart out of a book, not that she hadn't tried. At breakfast on Thursday she bored them all with stupid flying tips she'd gotten out of a library book called Quidditching with the Masters. Neville was hanging on to her every word, desperate for anything that might help him later on, but everybody else was very relieved when Hermione's lecture was interrupted by the arrival of the mail. Harry hadn't had a single letter since Hagrid's note, something that Malfoy had been quick to notice. So when Malfoy's pig brought him a package full of sweets from home, he gleefully shared with Harry. All Ron could do was stare in hunger and amazement at the tasty treats given to Harry. A pig brought Neville a small package from his grandmother. He opened it impatiently, spilling several juice goblets around him, and revealed a large black ball with a small flat area at the top. "It's my magic 8-ball," he explained. "I had forgotten this at home. This tells you if there's something you've forgotten to do. Watch, I shake it in my hand and ask it a question like this: have I forgotten something? And, oh." His face fell, because the flat area at the top revealed the words, "Yes." Neville was trying to remember what he'd forgotten when Draco Malfoy, who was passing the Gryffindor table, snatched the magic 8-ball out of his hand. Harry and Ron laughed at this because Neville didn't even notice. but Professor Hardcastle McCormick, who could spot trouble quicker than any teacher in the school, was there in a flash. "What's going on?" "Malfoy's got Neville's magic 8-ball, Professor," Ron snitched. Scowling, Malfoy quickly dropped the magic 8-ball back on the table. "Just prodding is all," he said, and he slithered away with Grabby and Goyle behind him. At 3:30 that afternoon, Harry, Ron, and the other Gryffindors frantically ran down the front steps onto the grounds for their first flying lesson. One girl tripped and took out 2 others. All 3 had to go to the hospital wing and missed their first lesson. It was a grey, drizzly kind of day, and the grass was slippery under their feet as they marched down the sloping lawns toward a flat patch on the opposite side of the grounds to the Forbidden Forest, whose trees were swaying darkly in the distance. The Slytherins were already there. Evidently being punctual was a strong quality for Slytherins, while being tardy was a notable trait of Gryffindors. There were 20 or so broomsticks piled in a pile. Harry had heard Fred and George Weasley complain about the school brooms, saying that some of them started to vibrate if you flew too high, or can on occasion snap in half mid-flight. Their teacher, Madame Hooch, was already standing there, stern and annoyed the Gryffindors were late yet again. She had short, grey hair, and yellow eyes like a fox. "Well, what took you all so long this time?" she barked. "Doesn't matter, everyone grab a broomstick. Come on, hurry up." Harry was last to pick out his broom. It was old and some of the twigs stuck out at odd angles and he was pretty sure the top part was rotting away. "Place your broom on the ground next to you and stick out your right hand over it," called Madame Hooch at the front, "and say activate." "Activate," everyone shouted. Malfoy's broom soared into his hand at once, but it was one of the few that did. Hermione Granger's had smacked her in the face before falling lifeless on the ground once more, and Neville's hadn't moved at all. Perhaps brooms, like pumas, could sense fear, thought Harry. There was a quiver in Neville's voice that said only too plainly that he wanted to keep his feet on land. Harry eventually got his into his hand after meeting the broom halfway. Madame Hooch then exhibited how to mount their brooms without sliding off the end, and walked up and down the rows correcting their grips. Harry and Ron were shocked when she told Malfoy he'd been doing it wrong for years. "Now, when I wish my whistle, kick off from the ground, intensely," said Madame Hooch. "Keep your sweepers stable, rise a few inches, and then come straight back down by leaning forward somewhat. On my whistle, 3, 2. But Neville, panicky and twitchy, pushed off hard before the whistle had touched Madame Hooch's succulent lips. "Come back, boy!" she shouted, but Neville was rising like a rocket blasting off to the moon, 20 feet, 50 feet. Harry could barely make out his terrified white face just before he slipped sideways off the broom end. Wham! After a thud and a nasty crack, Neville lay face down in the mud. His broomstick was still rising higher and higher, and soon out of sight. Madame Hooch was bending over Neville, her face red with rage. "Broken bones everywhere," Harry heard her mutter. "Come on, boy, I know it hurts but up you get." She spun round to the rest of the class. "None of you is to move while I take this boy to the hospital wing. You leave those brooms where they are or you'll be out of Hogwarts before you can say Avada Kedavra. Come on, stupid child." Neville, his face tear-streaked in pain, hobbled off with Madame Hooch, who had her arm around him. No sooner were they out of earshot than the class burst into laughter. "Did you see his face, the great lump? What a fat little crybaby. That doofus, he'll never hear the end of that one." "Ahoy!" said Malfoy, scurrying forward and snatching something out of the mud. "It's that silly thing Longbottom's granny sent him." The magic 8-ball sparkled in the drizzly rain as he held it high above his head for all to see. "Give that here, Malfoy," said Harry playfully. Malfoy smiled. "I'll fly over there so we can play catch. Want to give it a go?" Yeah, sounds fun. Harry yelled. Malfoy had leapt onto his broomstick and taken off. He hadn't been lying, he could fly very well. Hovering even with the topmost branches of an oak, he called, "Come and get it, Potter." Harry grabbed his broom. "No!" shouted Hermione Granger. "Madam Hooch told us not to move. I'm not taking the fall for your stupidity." Harry ignored her. Excitement was brewing in his head. He had never played catch before and wasn't going to pass up the opportunity now. He mounted the broom and kicked hard against the ground, and up he soared. Light rain rushed through his hair. He needed a shower anyway, and in a rush of fierce joy he realized he'd found something he could do without screwing it up. This was easy, this was wonderful. He pulled his broomstick up a little to take it even higher, and heard the admiring gasps of girls back on the ground and a favorable whoop from Ron. He turned his broomstick sharply to face Malfoy in midair. Malfoy looked impressed. "Give it here," Harry called. "Oh, yeah?" said Malfoy, feeling the need to test out Harry's skill. "Catch it if you can, then," he shouted, and he threw the 8-ball high into the air and streaked back toward the ground. Harry, as though in slow motion, saw the ball rise up in the air and then start to fall. He leaned forward and pointed his broom handle down. Next second he was gathering tremendous speed in a deep dive, racing the ball. Wind whistled in his ears, mingled with the screams of people watching. He stretched out his hand. A foot from the ground he caught it, just in time to pull his broom straight, and he toppled with great force into the mud with the magic 8-ball clutched safely in his fist. Golf claps were given all around. "Harry Potter! Get your butt over here!" He thought he was having a heart attack from the shock. Professor Hardcastle McCormick was running uncontrollably toward them. He got to his feet, trembling, and covered in mud. "Never, in my 7 decades at Hogwarts." Professor Hardcastle McCormick was speechless with shock, and she lifted her glasses up and down furiously as she eyed Harry. "Why, you don't even have a broken neck." "It was all his fault, Professor. Him and Malfoy, we had nothing to do." "Be quiet, Miss Granger, Potter, follow me, now." Harry caught sight of Malfoy's awestruck face as he left, walking numbly in Professor Hardcastle McCormick's wake as she stomped toward the castle. He was going to be expelled, he just knew it. There was nothing he could say that would weasel him out of this one. Professor Hardcastle McCormick was trotting along without ever looking at him. He had to jog to stay pace. He's done it now. He hadn't even lasted 2 weeks. He'd be packing his bags in 10 minutes' time. Oh, what the Drubbles Noughts would say when he turned up on the doorstep. Still, he lasted longer than he initially guessed. Up the front steps, up 3 marble staircase inside, and still Professor Hardcastle McCormick didn't say a word to him. She threw open doors and marched along corridors with Harry scurrying miserably behind her, leaving a rather large trail of mud everywhere they went. Maybe she was taking him to the Dumbledore? He thought of Hagrid, expelled but allowed to stay on as custodian. Perhaps he would be getting Hagrid's job after all. He felt sick to his stomach as he envisioned it, watching Malfoy and the others becoming wizards, while he toiled around the grounds cleaning toilets. Professor McCormick abruptly stopped outside a classroom. She opened the door and stuck her long neck inside. "I beg your pardon, Professor Flitwick, could I borrow wood for a moment? This is more important than lessons." "Wood?" thought Harry, befuddled. Wood as in a stick she would beat him with? But Wood turned out to be a person, a scrawny little 5th-year boy who came out of Flitwick's class looking confused. "Walk this way, you two," said Professor Hardcastle McCormick, as she skipped on up the corridor, Wood eyeing up Harry along the way. "In you go." Professor Hardcastle McCormick pointed them into a classroom that was empty except for Peeves, who was busy plastering slime on just about everything. "Peeves!" she barked. She threw chalk at him, which went right through and turned into powder upon crashing against the wall. Peeves flew away, cursing. Professor Hardcastle McCormick slammed the door behind him and turned to face the two boys. "Potter, this is Oliver Wood. Wood, I found you a new MB." Wood's expression altered from puzzlement to downright disgust. "You can't be serious, Professor." "Absolutely," said Professor Hardcastle McCormick sternly. "Harry's gifted, don't forget. I've never seen anything like it. Was that your first time on a broomstick, boy?" Harry nodded silently. He didn't have a clue what was going on. He caught that thing in his hand after a 50-foot dive, Professor Hardcastle McCormick told Wood as she tossed him the magic 8-ball. "Didn't break one bone. Theodore McMonagall couldn't even have done it." Wood was now looking at Harry with great interest, as though all his dreams had come true at once. "Ever seen a game of Quidditch, Potter?" he asked excitedly. Wood's the El Capitan of the Gryffindor team, Professor Hardcastle McCormick explained. "He's just the build for an MB, too," said Wood, now walking around Harry and staring at him. "Light speedy, we'll have to get him a decent broom, Professor, a nincompoop 2002 or a cheapskate 7, I'd say. I shall have to speak to Dumbledore and see if we can break the first-year rule. Heaven knows, we need a much better team than last year. Humiliated in that last match by Slytherin, Snape was in my face for weeks." Professor Hardcastle McCormick peered sternly over her glasses at Harry. "I want to hear you're training hard, Potter, even if it gets in the way of your studies, or I may change my mind about punishing you." You mean I'm not being expelled?" Harry asked with a glimmer of help in his eyes. Professor McCormick smiled. "My word, we can't expel you. You're Harry Potter. What will the papers say if we did? No, you have the Potter privilege. Just about a free pass to do anything, I reckon." "What about Malfoy? He was flying too." She raised her hand. "I'll be sending his father a pig and request that he give a very generous donation to the school library, or else Draco will be expelled. Rich families like that don't have their children expelled either. Fame and fortune will get you far in this world, and you, Harry Potter, have both. That's why I'm giving you this job without holding formal tryouts." Harry just looked up at her with a huge grin. "You know your father played for Gryffindor too. He was a mediocre Quidditch player at best," she said. "Fancy that." It was dinner time. Harry had just finished telling Ron what had happened when he left the grounds with Professor Hardcastle McCormick. Ron choked on a piece of steak and kidney pie when he heard the news. He then coughed several times and spit it out, spraying one of the girls across the table. "You made MB," he said. "But first years aren't even allowed to. You must be the youngest house player in about." "Youngest player ever," said Harry, shoveling pie into his mouth. He felt the urge to splurge after hearing he wasn't being expelled. Ron was so amazed, so impressed, he just sat and gaped at Harry for the next 30 minutes. "I start training next week," said Harry. "Only don't tell anyone. Wood wants to keep it a hush-hush. I'm the new secret weapon, I guess." Fred and George Weasley now came into the hall, spotted Harry, and hurried over. "Well done," said George in a low voice. "Wood told us. We're on the team too, we're betas." "I tell you, we're going to win the Quidditch Cup for sure this year," said Fred. "Gryffindor hasn't won a match in 20 years, but this year's team is going to be brilliant. You must be good, Harry, or Wood wouldn't have had any excitement when he told us. Anyway, we've got to go. Need to help Lee Jordan smuggle a new shipment in through a secret passageway out of the school." "A new shipment of what?" Ron asked. "Well, that's neat to know, isn't it? See you." Fred and George had hardly disappeared when the next group of imposers turned up, Malfoy, flanked by Grabby and Goyle. "Heard you're not being expelled, Potter. Is that true?" "Yeah," Harry replied. Harry told me your dad had to pay off the school in order to not be expelled, Ron spitted out. At least I have money, Weasley. You're too poor to afford dirt. Oh yeah, well why don't we see how big a man you are without your little bodyguards around? There was of course nothing at all little about Crabbe and Goyle, but as the high table was full of teachers, neither of them could do more than crack their knuckles and growl. I'd take you on any time on my own, said Malfoy. Tonight, if you want. A wizard's duel. Wands only, no contact. What's the matter? Afraid of a little dueling? Of course not, said Ron, wheeling around. Harry's my second, who's yours? Malfoy looked at Crabbe and Goyle, sizing them up. I shall also take Harry to be my second, he said. Midnight. As is tradition? We'll meet you in the trophy room, that's always unlocked. When Malfoy had gone, Ron and Harry looked at each other. Now what am I being roped into? Asked Harry. And what do you mean, I'm your second? Well, a second's the to take over if you die, said Ron casually, getting started at last on his fifth cold pie. Catching the look on Harry's face, he added quickly, but people only die in proper duels, you know, with real wizards. The most we'll be able to do is send sparks at each other. Neither of us knows enough magic to do any real damage. And what if he does kill you? Then I'll have to step in and fight him? Yeah, I suppose, Ron advised. Excuse me. They both looked up. It was Hermione Granger, the girl Ron had spitted on earlier. Can't a person eat in peace in this place? Ron said with a mouthful of food. Hermione ignored him and spoke anyway. I couldn't help overhearing what you and Malfoy were saying. Bet you could, Ron muffled. And you mustn't go moseying around the place at night. Think of the tremendous amounts of points you'll lose Gryffindor if you're caught. And you're bound to be since I'm squealing the moment you step out the door. It's really very selfish of you, you know. You won't tell. You have a vested interest in us not getting caught. Think of all those points. Goodbye, said Ron. What a peculiar day it has been, Harry thought, as he lay awake much later listening to Dean and Seamus talking in their sleep. Neville wasn't yet back from the hospital wing. Ron had spent all evening blabbering about his strategy, such as if he tries to curse me, I'll just dodge it, because I can't remember how to block them. There was a very good chance they were going to get caught by Filch or Mrs. Norris, and Harry would face expulsion yet again by breaking another school rule. On the other hand, this was his big chance to see Ron humiliate himself. He couldn't miss it. Plus, Professor Hardcastle McCormick told him he had Potter privilege and couldn't be expelled anyway. 11:30, Ron muttered at last, we better skedaddle. They pulled on their neon bathrobes, picked up their wands, and tippy-toed across the tower room, down the spiral staircase, and into the Gryffindor common room. A few embers were still sparking in the fireplace, making this a very dangerous place to be with all of the flammable rugs and tapestries about. They had almost reached the portrait hole when an armchair struggled to spin around and face them. Aha! I can't believe you're actually doing this. A lamp ticked on. It was Hermione Granger, wearing nothing but a neon pink bathrobe and a frown. You! Said Ron furiously. I'm gonna kill you. With a wave of her arm, Ron's wand was disarmed. I told your brother, Hermione snapped, Percy, I thought he was perfect, but he didn't believe you would do something so foolish. Meanwhile Harry couldn't believe anyone could be so intrusive. Come on, let's go, said Ron picking up his wand. He shoved open the portrait of the fat bikini lady and climbed through the hole. Hermione wasn't going to stand down that easily. She yelled at them as they exited. You don't care about Gryffindor, you only care about yourselves. I don't want Slytherin to win the House Cup, and you lose all those many points I got from Professor Hardcastle McCormick for snitching on those Viacom students. Bah. Go away. All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. They had closed the portrait of the fat bikini lady behind them but found themselves facing an empty painting. She had evidently gone on a questionable nighttime visit. Ron stated, "We've got to go, we're going to be late. Come on." They hadn't even reached the end of the corridor when Harry tripped over something. "Yow!" something said. It was Neville. He was curled up on the floor, fast asleep, but jerked suddenly awake as Harry plowed into him. "Thank goodness you found me. I've been out here for hours, I couldn't remember the new password to get into bed." "Keep your voice down, Neville. The password's password but it won't help you now, the fat bikini lady's gone off on a booty call or something." "How's your body now?" said Harry. "Fine," said Neville, getting up. "Madam Pom-Pom mended me in about a minute. Said I had 28 broken bones, a new record." "That's so? Well, look, Neville, we've got somewhere to be, we'll catch you on the flip side." "No, don't leave me here," said Neville, grabbing Harry's robe. "I don't want to stay here alone, the bloody Baron's already messed with me twice." Ron looked at his pocket watch and then glared furiously at Neville. "If you get us caught, I'll never rest until I've learned that curse of the boogie squirrel told us about, and used it on you." Harry hissed at him to be quiet and beckoned them all forward. They floated along the corridors sparkling with moonlight from the high windows. At every turn Harry panicked he'd run into Filch or Mrs. Norris, but they were ever so fortunate. They zipped up a flight of stairs to the 3rd floor and crept toward the trophy room. Malfoy wasn't there yet. The cups, shields, plates, and statues on display winked silver and gold in the darkness. Harry winked back. They edged along the walls, keeping their eyes on the doors at either end of the room. Ron took out his wand in case Malfoy leapt in and started at once. The minutes piled up. "He's late, that or he's chickened out. Either way, I declare myself the victor," Ron determined. Then a clamor from the next room made them jump 3 feet into the air. Ron had cocked his wand ready to fire when they heard someone speak, and it sure wasn't Malfoy. "Get a good whiff all around, my sweet, they might be lurking in a corner." It was Filch speaking to that freak of nature Mrs. Norris. Horrified, Harry waved madly at the others to follow him as quickly as possible. They scooted silently toward the door, away from Filch's voice. Ron's bathrobe had barely whipped round the corner when they heard Filch enter the trophy room from the other side. "They're in here somewhere," they heard him mutter, "I can smell their bath salts." Everyone looked at Harry. "What?" Harry shrugged. "This way." He mouthed to the others and, petrified, they began to creep down a long gallery full of suits of armor. They could hear Filch gaining hot on their trail. Neville suddenly let out a frightened shriek and broke into a full run after saying he couldn't take it anymore, but smashed right into a full suit of armor. The clanging and crashing were enough to wake the whole castle. "Every man for himself!" Harry yelled, and the 3 of them sprinted down the gallery, not looking back to see whether Filch was following. They swung around the doorpost and galloped down one corridor then another, Harry in the lead, without any idea where they were or where they were going. They ripped through a tapestry and found themselves in a hidden passageway, hurtled along it and smashed through a locked door, closing it hurriedly behind them. "That hormone," Ron said to Harry. "You realize it, don't you? Filch knew someone was going to be in the trophy room. Hormone must have tipped him off." Harry thought he was probably right, and they'd have to confront her later. They could hear footsteps, Filch running fast trying to track the students before his scent trail had faded. "We're done for. This is the end." Ron panicked. They pressed their ears against it, listening. All they heard now was the sound of Filch cursing in rage. "I think we've fudged him, he's not following us this way," Harry puffed, peering back through the keyhole. Neville was wheezing and spitting, trying to catch his breath sitting on the ground while Ron closed his eyes in relief. He must not know about that secret passageway we stumbled upon, Harry whispered. Oh, what luck that was, lol. I think we'll be okay. Get off, Neville. For Neville had been tugging on the bottom of Harry's bathrobe from the floor. What is it? Are you dying? Harry turned around, and saw, quite clearly, what? For a moment, he was sure he'd walked into a nightmare. This was too much, on top of everything that had happened so far. They weren't in a room, as he had supposed. They were in a corridor. The forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor. And now they knew why it was forbidden. For you see, in this room was something so horrible, something so wretched and mind-numbingly inconceivable that the students just stared at what they saw. And what they saw would haunt you for the rest of your days, because what they saw should not exist. It had to have been some sort of freak magical accident conducted when doing magic-tific research by one of the teachers. It was the only explanation for why this thing, which will shortly be revealed, stood in front of them. It's just that, wherever it came from, it had to have had only one purpose for being here, to kill and destroy anything that crosses its path. They were looking right into the eyeballs of a monstrous dog, a dog that filled the entirety of the room before them. Only this demon of a dog had 3 heads. 3 pairs of rolling, mad eyes, 3 noses, twitching and quivering in their direction, 3 drooling mouths, saliva hanging in slippery ropes from 3 sets of yellowish fangs, convenient enough for one for each boy. It was standing quite still, all 6 eyes staring at them, and Harry knew that the only reason they weren't already dead was that their sudden appearance had taken it by surprise. But it was quickly getting over that. There was no mistaking what those thunderous growls meant. Nope. Harry yelled. He groveled for the doorknob. Between Filch and certain death, he'd take the Filch. All 3 scurried through the way they came in. Harry slammed the door shut behind them. We've got to get back to Gryffindor Tower, said Harry, as quickly as conceivable. And they ran, they almost flew, back from whence they came. Filch must have scampered off to look for them elsewhere because they didn't see any sign of him, but as if they cared, all they wanted to do was use as much energy as possible to get back to their nice, warm, safe waiting beds. They didn't stop running until they reached the portrait of the fat bikini lady on the 7th floor. Where on earth have you all been? She asked, looking at their bathrobes hanging off their shoulders as they flashed some skin. Where have we been? She asks, Ron muttered, where have you been? Touche, said the fat bikini lady. Never mind that, password, panted Harry, and the portrait swung forward. They scrambled into the common room and collapsed, trembling, outstretched on the floor. What do they think they're doing, keeping a thing like that locked up in a school? Said Ron out of breath. If they come asking for volunteer dog walkers, count me out. Well, look who came running back. Hermione was still awake and had horrible trouble spinning around her armchair once more, evidently waiting to see if the boys would return. I must say I am impressed you were not caught. Yeah, no thanks to you. You little snitch, Filch was all over us from the get-go. I just know you squealed to him about us sneaking out. Prove it, Hermione smiled. And I have you know that we were almost killed by a dog out there. Ron added. A dog? Hey, this was not your run-of-the-mill pooch. It was big and hideous and had to be 5 stories high, no 8. Harry chimed in. And it had 3 heads. Ron added to Harry. How interesting. Well, you're either making this all up or it must be there to guard something. She stood up, glaring at them. I hope you're pleased with yourselves. I am ever so disappointed you made it back here alive. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to bed. Ron just stared in disgust. No, we don't mind, he said. But Hermione had given Harry an inkling as he clambered back into bed. The hound had to be protecting something. Maybe that was the entrance to Dumbledore's office? No, that couldn't be it. How would Dumbledore get past it in the morning? Wait, what had Hagrid said? Gringotts was the safest place in the world for something you wanted to hide, except Hogwarts. It looked as though Harry had stumbled upon where that oblong-shaped package from Vault 713 went and, Dumbledore's new side business.